Hey everybody, Gareth here, FCP Euro. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today we're going to be replacing a drive shaft on an E46 M3. There's a lot of different reasons why you might need to replace the drive shaft on any car, not just specifically an E46 M3, but any, especially cars that have a multi-piece drive shaft such as the E46 M3. We have our center support bearing here. This is a very common source of issues. It has an integrated U-joint, which is another point of failure, along with a CV joint at the back portion of the drive shaft that goes to differential. All these are wear items. These are all things that could potentially fail at some point during the ownership period of your car. Along with that, there is the possibility for the drive shaft to become unbalanced over time or out of balance. That could cause a lot of different vibrations and severe discomfort, depending on how bad that is. So we have here is a Powertrain Industries remanufactured drive shaft. Before, these were not really possible to get a hold of. You had to buy brand new drive shafts from BMW or buy a used one, which is always going to be of questionable condition. You never really know what you're getting into. But while we're in there today, we're also going to be replacing the drive shaft gibo, which is the flex joint at the transmission. We have a Miley HD version for that today. And we're replacing the mounting hardware while we're in there as well. One thing I did forget to mention, the remanufactured drive shaft comes with a new drive shaft end bushing, which is pre-installed. That does support the weight of the drive shaft on the transmission output shaft. So this is pretty much a complete assembly ready to install. And with that said, obviously all these parts are available at fcpero.com, but let's talk about some of the tools we're gonna need to do this job, and we'll go ahead and jump right into it. So in order to move the drive shaft from your E46 M3, you're also gonna have to remove the exhaust out of the way. 8mm and 10mm for removing a lot of the heat shields and things like that, 13mm for the exhaust hangers, and then for physically removing the drive shaft, you're gonna need an 18mm socket, 18mm wrenches, E12 torque socket, a variety of ratchets, and if you have access to impact guns, that'll obviously make it a little bit easier. A flathead screwdriver for physically removing the CV joint from the pinion. There's a couple of different pry points on that that allow you to get that out, and of course, torque wrench when you go to reinstall it. So this is a very high mileage E46 M3, and being as such, it is not perfect. It's missing some of the underbody pieces that I would personally choose to remove just to make life a little bit easier, such as the splash shield up here. But I'm gonna start by removing our reinforcement plate. Reason for that is I need this whole transmission engine assembly to tilt back. It's not gonna do that if it's sitting on this. So 16mm bolts, we're just gonna pull all those out, get that out of the way, and then we'll move on to start to remove the exhaust. We don't have any matching exhaust hardware holding the mid-pipe to the manifolds. So it's like 13s, 14s, and I think maybe a 17. And I don't know what size these nuts are, but I'm gonna go ahead and just use pliers on them. We're gonna be replacing all of this hardware with the correct stuff. But like I said, this is not the most prime example in the world, but chances are if this was something that you purchased for yourself and it was on a budget, you're probably gonna run into stuff like this. So you just have to work with what you have. We're going to remove this center section here. It's basically just a chassis reinforcement, but it's also one of the hangers for the exhaust system. It's held in with 13mm bolts. Next up, we're going to remove this cross brace here. It triangulates the subframe to the chassis. It's 16mm bolts, 3 of them. And word of caution, it is somewhat heavy, so when you're removing that last bolt, just be aware of that. So we have 3 exhaust hangers that hold the muffler in place, 2 on the left side, 1 on the right side. It's held in with 13mm nuts, 2 per hanger. We're gonna go ahead and remove those now. And it goes without saying, make sure that the weight of the exhaust is properly supported. The rear suitcase muffler is gonna be the heaviest portion of the exhaust. So if you're doing this by yourself, have the proper supports. If you have a friend that can help you, even better. I got Ben supporting the exhaust from the front. I'm gonna lower it down from the rear using this transmission jack. Next up, we're gonna go ahead and remove our heat shield. That's to get to the drive shaft. It's held with a bunch of 8 and 10mm nuts and screws. So these are 10mm, and then you have sort of these stamped nuts that are 8mm. But you'll want a deep socket for those just because a standard socket's not gonna have the clearance you need. So we are gonna be replacing this drive shaft. It looks like a center support's been replaced on it at some point, but there is a little bit of play in the U-joint. I can move both halves of the drive shaft independently quite a bit from one another. And there's quite a bit of grease, and you see some brownish reddish dust in there, which pretty good indicator of a U-joint on its way out. So we'll deal with that later. But right now we're gonna focus on unbolting the drive shaft from the transmission. I'm gonna move the transmission cross member. It's only 13mm bolts and nuts, so super simple. We're gonna remove that first, and then we'll have access to the nuts that secure the bolts to the output flange of the transmission. Now when you're doing this, everything is going to kind of droop back. That's totally fine, don't worry about that, it's not gonna go anywhere. This has a vibration damper here. I'm actually gonna loosen up the 13mm nuts for the transmission mounts and just slide that out of the way, just to give myself a little bit extra room to work with. We have 3 18mm bolts and nuts we're gonna remove. I'm specifically focusing on the bolt that goes to the flange on the transmission. All right, we have 6 E12 bolts that holds the CV joint to the differential pinion flange. We're gonna go ahead and remove those now. Now we just wanna pull the CV joint off the flange a little bit. There's a little bit of a prying point here. I'm gonna use a favorite tool in the toolbox, aka the flathead screwdriver. Give it a quick push. And we have 2 13mm nuts that hold the center support to the bottom of the chassis. We'll move those now. Drive shafts out. We need to do a little bit of prep work. Most notably, install the drive shaft gebo first. One thing to note on these gebos, there's a little arrow. You'll see that they alternate direction. Doesn't matter which side is installed. What matters is that this arrow is pointing to a flange. If you install backwards, it's not designed to handle that type of torque. It'll cause the gebo to fail prematurely. You don't want to do that. So in our case, this is how we're doing it. Arrow here pointing to flange, and then obviously when we go to put it up to the car, it'll alternate accordingly. These are class 10.9 bolts. There's a different torque spec for 10.9, 12.9, etc. BMW has kind of changed the classification of the bolts over time. So we're gonna make sure that these are torqued in advance before we go ahead and put it in the car. We're installing class 10.9 bolts, so the torque spec is gonna be 60 Newton meters. If it's 12.9, it's 100, and then there's one other spec for 8.8. Don't know if I've ever seen those before, but. Now, for whatever reason, powertrain, they've installed bolts for you. Actually, they're studs. That's not gonna work for us. We do have replacement bolts for this. I'm gonna go ahead and tap these out. The flange on this car requires the bolts to go into it. It doesn't have a nut on the backside. It's not a big deal. We'll just tap these studs out and we'll install the correct hardware. It's no big deal. Now we're gonna go ahead and lift the drive shaft up into position. The drive shaft end bushing, which is at the gebo end, has been pre-greased, so we don't need to do that. And that's gonna slip on this pilot. The CV joint obviously goes to our pinion flange in the rear, and I have the 2 nuts for the center support here. So once I kind of bend it up into position, I'm gonna support the weight of the drive shaft via the center support. All right, from there it's safe. I'm gonna start by installing all the bolts at the transmission end, and then we'll go to the CV joint end here at the differential. And yeah, we'll start butting this thing up. Just tapping these bolts in by hand. Obviously the transmission is still drooping back because we haven't put the cross member back in. That's fine. Again, it's really hard to get to the nuts with the cross member in place. And this gebo is very flexible. That's not gonna cause any damage. Torque spec, 60 Newton meters. Torque spec for these bolts is 85 Newton meters. Torque spec for our center support is going to be 30 Newton meters, 13 millimeter. So at this point, we're ready to reinstall the transmission cross member. That, of course, has to go back in before we install the exhaust. That would be horrible if we didn't. So really, this is just going to slide into place. Have to bend the heat shield slightly out of the way. And we also need to make sure that the mounting nuts here at the top are backed off enough so it could slide into the flange here on the transmission housing. Now that the cross member's in, we'll go ahead and tighten the transmission mount nuts here to the top, and will be completely installed on that end. And unfortunately, you have to go at it with an open-ended wrench just because you don't have enough room to really get in there with anything else. So now we have the transmission cross member in. We're going to reinstall our heat shield here. This particular vehicle was only held in with 4 of these 10mm screws. So that is how we're going to reinstall it. We remove the old exhaust gaskets. These are long past their prime. Go ahead and install our new exhaust gaskets. That will ensure that there's no exhaust leak. You can see how these new ones have kind of like this conical thing going on. That's how they're supposed to look when they're not totally deformed. So at this point, ready to reinstall the exhaust, and obviously we talked about it's heavy as hell. It is definitely something you want to have a friend for. Now that we have the exhaust up into a relative decent position, go ahead and put a couple of bolts here at the manifolds that at least hold the exhaust in place up in front while working the rear. Really want to get the rear up in position first before start cranking anything down up here. And the hardware that we're installing now is the correct hardware and is what should be on the car. Now that the rear hangers are done, we'll go ahead and push up our center support here for the exhaust. These are all 13mm screws. And recall, we have another cross brace that sat right here. This is held in with the same 13mm screws. It's going to be E12 and 14mm for the correct exhaust hardware. So now that the exhaust has been installed, we can reinstall the rear cross brace here. Remember, on one side, the lift arm is kind of in the way, so I have to use a wrench on it. But what I try to do is get it in position and then, you know, get one bolt here at the subframe to kind of support the weight of this thing. And then from there, we can go about getting it installed properly. Have a reinforcement plate that's going to go back here at the front. Like I said earlier, no splash shield. Missing some panels back here, so depending on the condition of your car, you might have more to install. But for us, this is going to be the end of the line. So that's how you go about installing a drive shaft on the E46 M3. They're always going to have this 6-bolt flange in the rear. They're always going to have a 6-bolt gebo in the front, and they always have a center support. So SMG or non-SMG really doesn't matter. It's the exact same drive shaft. Obviously, we did have to make that little modification here. We had to remove those studs that Powertrain Industries installed in the CV joint in the rear. Not a big deal. They pop right out. We just used the factory hardware. All torque to spec. Pretty straightforward. A lot of different reasons why you'd have to pull a drive shaft out. Pinion seal repair, clutch job, a whole bunch of different things you might be doing. So it's important to know how to do this. We hope you learned a lot in this video. If you have any questions or comments, leave it in the box below. We'll get back to you. Hit that like button if you like this video. Hit subscribe. We have a lot more on the way. As always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.